Wounding. No more narcissist. It is a common misunderstanding and myth when it appertains to our kind that you can cause us to stay away forever as a consequence of wounding us. I often read people writing, "Oh, the narcissist will never be back. I wounded him far too extensively. I caused massive wounding. I'll never hear from him again." That is emotional thinking and belies a misunderstanding about the way that we are and also the way that hoovering actually occurs. For some people, and this is the majority that make this point, it's based upon a misunderstanding and the effect of emotional thinking. Your emotional thinking has prevented you from seeing with insight that, notwithstanding the explanations that you've been provided by my work, you still believe that the narcissist will stay away from you. Essentially what is happening is your high emotional thinking, because you've been interacting recently with the narcissist, and remember, that doesn't just mean spending time with the narcissist or communicating with the narcissist. There are other ways you can interact with the narcissist which are indirect, which affect your emotional thinking. And this increased emotional thinking corrupts certain of your traits. In this instance, your empathic trait of justice, or your narcissistic trait of pride, or your narcissistic trait of anger. And it causes you to erroneously believe that the wounding that you have caused to the narcissist will mean that the narcissist has slunk away, mid-range tail between his legs, never to be seen again. No. There are a number of reasons why this is incorrect. This is a common misunderstanding and usually the product, as I have said, of emotional thinking. In some instances, however, this comment is being made by a narcissist who, of course, can't accept that they're being told that the believed narcissist will come back, because that offends their sense of control. So the unaware narcissist says, "Oh, I have wounded the perceived narcissist so good, they'll stay away from me." Grandiosity, sense of entitlement, lack of accountability, and is an assertion of control over the perceived threat caused to control by the potential return of that perceived narcissist who is actually most likely the victim. And therefore the narcissist crows about how they've driven that individual away. Understand, I am not saying that everybody who makes that remark is a narcissist. Further examination has to be made. Usually the remark is made by people who don't understand narcissism properly, and they are, in essence, not applying logic because of heightened emotional thinking. But in some instances, this is a narcissist talking, because they think that they are the victim, and they don't see, because of they're blinded by their narcissism, that they are dealing with actually a non-narcissist. And they crow, saying that they've caused that person to go away, not realising that actually there is a potential for return, because they might have been ensnared by another narcissist, or if it's a victim, the victim isn't actually wounded and would come back for perhaps reasons affected by their emotional thinking, trying to start the relationship up again, get money back, resolve situations with the children, etc. So where people declare, "Oh, I've wounded the narcissist hugely, they'll never be back," sometimes that's a narcissist talking, but more usually that's a declaration by somebody who doesn't understand narcissism and they're being affected by their high emotional thinking. And that emotional thinking has to come down to allow them to apply the logic to understand what is occurring and that actually there is a risk. I do not tell you all of this for the purposes of making it sound like we are some kind of Terminator-like machine that's going to keep rising and coming back, but rather so that you understand what's going on so you don't make stupid mistakes. I'm explaining this to give you the logic with which to defend yourself so you avoid complacency. So, having established the erroneous belief of that individual that massive wounding will always mean that the narcissist will be kept away, what then actually means that there is a risk that the narcissist will come back? Why might that happen? Well, first of all, what is it that causes the narcissist to hoover? A hoover trigger and the hoover execution criteria being met. Accordingly, if you text the narcissist, ring the narcissist, call round at the narcissist's house, start talking about the narcissist so that word reaches him that you're talking about what a bad person he is, you keep walking past where the narcissist is so he sees you, you'll enter a sphere of influence and cause a hoover trigger, leading to the possibility that you will be hoovered. But let us say that you're abiding by a no-contact regime and you're not doing any of those things. There will still be a hoover trigger, irrespective of what you're doing, because the narcissist will either be reminded of you by somebody mentioning your name, be reminded of you by seeing something or smelling something or hearing something that reminds the narcissist of you, and thirdly, you can just pop into the narcissist's head in the way that suddenly into my head comes the idea of enjoying this evening a lovely cold glass of Chablis. Now, accordingly, this means that there is a risk, there's always a risk of a hoover trigger, because even if you put in place a really good no-contact regime, and well done for doing so, you've got no control over us being reminded of you or just happening to think about you. So that's why there's always a risk. You can never say there'll never be a hoover. There's always that risk. It doesn't mean, though, that you're guaranteed to be hoovered because of what comes next. When there is a hoover trigger, you've come up on our radar for whatever reason, and the narcissism determines, first of all, shall we assert control over this person by a direct assertion of control? That's done in the unconscious by the narcissism of the lesser or mid-range, and it is a conscious thought of the calculating greater and ultra. And the direct assertion of control either takes place where we're in the room with you, so a proximate response, or a hoover, where we're not physically proximate to you and we either come to see you or ring you up, we text you, etc. Will the narcissist then hoover you where you have caused substantial wounding? Well, first of all, have you caused substantial wounding? Many people think that they have when actually they haven't. And to determine whether you have or not, utilise the material, the 3 interactions with the narcissist, and finally understand wounding. Because often you think you've wounded the narcissist when you haven't. So you need to establish that. But let us assume that you have. That you have ignored us and caused that wounding. Does this mean that you will never be hoovered? Does it mean that we will always stay away from you? No. Here's why. As I've explained, there's always a risk of a hoover trigger. When that hoover trigger happens, and it always will at some point, sooner or later, because at some point, even if you stay away from us, we will be reminded of you or think about you. You will pop into our head some point in the future. It might be weeks, it might be months, it might even be years. But you will come up on the radar at some point. The narcissism then ascertains whether the direct assertion of control can occur by way of a hoover. And essentially, it's like a set of scales. And some things go on it which say, yes, good to go for hoover. Some things say, don't hoover. And they balance against one another. If you have caused huge wounding to us, then this is a factor which says, no hoover. If that is the only relevant factor, and it usually isn't, but let's say that it is, at the point of the hoover trigger, no hoover happens. The narcissism says, too dangerous in effect, too great a risk of being wounded again. In effect, the narcissist is still licking his wounds, sore from the wounding that has occurred. And the narcissism, remember, is a self-defense mechanism, so it's not going to cause the narcissist to assert control by a hoover, because there's a huge risk the narcissist will get wounded again. And given their already wounded situation, a second massive wounding could prove very difficult indeed for the narcissist and plunge them into a fuel crisis. So the narcissism says no, and instead looks to assert control by the second or third assertion of control. So, where there has been massive wounding and there is a hoover trigger, and there are no other criteria which suggest hoovering, you won't be hoovered. But that's not permanent, and here's why. There, of course, will be other factors, and some of those factors, in aggregate, may even outweigh the effect of massive wounding, driving us to try again, even though we have just been wounded. For example, the need for residual benefits, the need for fuel, the absence of alternatives with regard to gaining fuel, the appearance of malice, the ease by which we can hoover you. You're our next door neighbour, for instance. Those are just some of the factors which might, when combined, tip the balance. So on the one hand, you have massive wounding, and on the other hand, you have all of those other factors, and they outweigh the effect of the massive wounding, and thus the green light comes on, and you're hoovered. Doesn't mean that it will succeed, but it will be tried, and therefore you are hoovered. Now, in general terms, it is rather rare for that to happen when the massive wounding has just occurred. Where you've massively wounded the narcissist, it takes some very unusual circumstances for that to be outweighed, say, the day after. And where there's been massive wounding, generally speaking, unless there are those very significant factors, you could be left alone for a number of weeks, even a couple of months. But thereafter, the situation changes. Over time, the effect of your wounding fades, and therefore it doesn't weigh as heavy on that side of those scales. Add in the other factors which cause it more likely for you to be hoovered, the scales tip. And thereafter, the effect of the wounding is not as strong, therefore its restraint on the hoover occurring is much reduced. And therefore, the aggregate factors which could cause hoovering outweigh it, meaning, green light, the hoover is made. And that's why a hoover could happen a few weeks later. If it doesn't, it is because either there's been no hoover trigger, therefore there's no need to hoover you, or if there has, the wounding still outweighs those other factors, therefore you don't get a hoover, the narcissist asserts control over you in a different manner. Sometimes it's because the narcissist, although they could hoover you, the narcissism deems that it's not appropriate, not because of the wounding, but because their needs can be met elsewhere, and they are better off not hoovering you to avoid them damaging control over somebody else. A clear example of that is where the narcissist has gone and got a new primary source. They're focused on that person, they don't need you anymore, and even though you wounded them recently, and that might be outweighed by other factors, the fact that they are with a new person means that they're not going to hoover you, not because of the wounding, but because the narcissism doesn't want to mess up the control over the new intimate partner primary source. And that's why you're not hoovered. It isn't actually anything particularly to do with your wounding anymore, and it all to do with the fact that the narcissist is with somebody else. Time goes on. The wound has gone. The reset button, in effect, has been pressed. The wound has healed. And therefore, when there is a hoover trigger at a later juncture, there is no wounding at all to move against you being hoovered. Therefore, there is a chance that the green light will come on and you'll be hoovered. If it doesn't happen at that juncture, it's nothing to do with the fact of your wounding. The effect of that has faded. We could be talking 6 months on, a year on. The wounding has faded by this point. It is an irrelevant factor for the hoover execution criteria. What is relevant are other matters which might mean the narcissist doesn't hoover you because they're still in the golden period with somebody else. Therefore, the narcissism states, unconsciously, don't hoover the ex. It could cause problems with the current IPPS. We'll ignore the ex or smear them in order to assert control over them. And we'll draw fuel from the existing current primary source, character traits, residual benefits. We can assert control over the former IPPS or former IPSS without a hoover, and we don't need anything else from them. So we don't need to hoover them for those reasons as well. And you're left alone. Nothing to do with your wounding. So you might think that the reason you've not heard from the narcissist is because of your wounding. That is probably correct in the days, weeks, and maybe a couple of months after that wounding has occurred. But beyond that, the reason you haven't heard from the narcissist is because there are other factors meaning that he doesn't need to hoover you. And that's why you're not hearing from the narcissist. Understand, most of the time, you will be hoovered. And if it's sometimes since you've heard from the narcissist, that's not the effect of the wounding, it's because the narcissist hasn't needed to hoover you, because they haven't needed to hoover you for control, and they haven't needed to hoover you for fuel, character traits, and residual benefits. All of those things can be achieved without hoovering you, hence you're not hoovered. But a lot of the time, we can. Of course, the other reason why you may not have been hoovered is because you've put in place an effective no-contact regime, and that's what you need to aim for. And then you won't even know you've been hoovered because we've rung the old number, can't get through. You've moved house, we went to the old house. We have hoovered you, but you don't get to hear about it. So, it is important for you to understand that no matter how extensively you wound the narcissist, this does not mean that the narcissist will leave you alone forever. It means that most likely in the immediate period after that wounding, unless there are exceptional circumstances caused by other Hoover execution criteria, you will be left alone. In the medium term, after a couple of months, your risk of being hoovered increases, and you probably will be hoovered, because the wounding has reduced in its effect and will continue to be outweighed by new criteria. If you're not hoovered in that period of time, it is because there's something else, meaning that we don't hoover you. Finally, after a period of a few months, the effect of your wounding, where it's massive, has evaporated. The wound has healed. And that means the risk of you being hoovered has increased. And if you're not hoovered, it's because it's a different factor which is causing the narcissist to stay away from you. Do understand that massive wounding is not a solution to keeping the narcissist away from you. There are other factors at play, and the most effective thing that you can do is impose, maintain, and continue a no-contact regime. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.